Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, the never-ending vaccine passport, compelled speech, and rising government spending.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. It is Thursday, October 14th, 2021. Great to have you tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North. We have a great show planned for you. We'll be talking, well, I say great, I should probably stop saying that because oftentimes we are talking about things that are not exactly fantastic. And I've often said that, the worse things are for the world and the country, the better they are for the show, because if everything were great, I would just be able to say, hey, what's up? Okay, see you next week. So it's great in the sense that we've got a lot of things to get through, and we'll talk about them in a way that hopefully is not totally depressing. But at the end of the day, I don't want to oversell it because things are pretty grim if you are a freedom lover. If you're not a freedom lover, then, you're probably not listening to the show, but you're probably also not all that displeased with how things are. Later on, we'll be talking to Fraser Institute senior economist Jake Fuss about the state of government spending. Again, not exactly a hopeful message. Also going to be talking in the next little bit about the never-ending vaccine passport infrastructure, a theme I've spoken about in the past, but we have some new evidence that it's going to be sticking around for quite a while. But before we get into the swing of things, I will start with a bit of personal news. It is my birthday today, so I can indulge, and you have to oblige, I think, for the next 30 seconds anyway. I launched a newsletter this week over at Substack. You can subscribe by heading over to andrewlawton.substack.com. The newsletter is called Andrew Lawton. Very creative, I know. And why I've done this is because for several years now, I've written a regular column, and I've moved it around. It's moved around on me, and every now and then I'll write in different places. But I was kind of at the point where I felt like I needed to have a home that was mine for that product and for other things that I want to share that don't necessarily fit into other things that I'm doing. And let me say, for starters, this has nothing to do with my work at True North in the sense that I'm not leaving. I'm still going to do my show. I'm still going to write for True North. I'm still going to do all of that stuff. If anything, it is a great compliment to my show because I'm able to extrapolate on some of the things I talk about in the show and perhaps cover some of the stories that don't make it into the show. But I wanted to do it, and I've gotten some great feedback already from some of you who have subscribed. If you want to, you can head on over to andrewlawton.substack.com. And by the way, one thing I'll say, it's a completely free newsletter. You have the option to get a paid subscription. I'm not telling you to do that at all. In fact, if you want to put some money towards independent media, do support the work we're doing here at True North. This is where I'm doing the bulk of my work and will continue to. The newsletter is just a little add-on. But I wanted to say that, yes, I'm doing it, but no, I'm not leaving here. Quite the contrary. I'm doing more and more work with True North and absolutely loving it. Let's talk about what's happening in Alberta, though. Last week, Premier Jason Kenney gave a press conference in which he announced that Albertans could now download a QR code to use as a vaccine passport as the province expands this program, which Jason Kenney for months had said he would never do and then all of a sudden did. Now, the case in Alberta, as we hear from the Alberta public health officials, is quite dire. They've got ICU capacity issues. They've got hospital issues. And I don't even want to get into all of that right now. I want to talk about the long-term forecast of these measures like the vaccine passport, which I'm very insistent will not go away easily. The fundamental nature of these types of programs is that government, like government infrastructure in general, is not in the business of dismantling barriers. What government wants to do is build things and then keep them going because they allow the bureaucracy to have a raison d'etre and so on. And this is where we are. Now, I asked Jason Kenney at this press conference about what the off-ramp was. The question, I think, was a very important one and one that no one else has been asking in Alberta or elsewhere. What are the metrics for success that would make the vaccine passport obsolete? Because remember, with a lot of the other lockdown measures, the government officials would say, okay, when our case counts are here, when our hospital capacity is here, then we'll drop them. And they did this as a way to have some transparency, but also motivate people to get through this process and, quote unquote, do the right thing. And here's the exchange with Premier Kenney.
For the restriction exemption program and other restrictive measures that are in place. Is there an off-ramp that's baked into this? Is there a point or a metric at which you think this program is no longer necessary that you can share either with case counts, hospitalizations, or simply vaccination rate?
Thank you, Andrew. The straight answer to that is no. We have not defined a particular criteria to end the program. I fully expect that we will have it in place through at least the first quarter of next year of 2022, because we are headed into an uncertain period. Even if we continue to see downward momentum in the case numbers and hospitalization numbers, even if we exit this fourth wave through the month of October, we will have to be on our guard as we go into colder weather, when people spend more time indoors. We will head into seasonal headwinds in terms of viral spread. And we will also maybe experiencing waning protection, both from naturally acquired immunity through prior infection and potentially through vaccines as well. The jury is still out on exactly when, but we do know that both of those kinds of immunity, from prior infection and from vaccines, can wane over time. So between weather, seasonal patterns, more indoor activity, and the potential for waning protection, we don't want to let down our guard, let's say in November, if we get out of this fourth wave, only to potentially face a Christmas spike or a winter spike. So I think we've just adopted the program. It seems to be working well. The businesses with whom I've spoken generally seem happy with it. Many of them say this is exactly what they wanted, and they thank us for having put it in place. I want to thank the vast majority of Albertans for cooperating with the program. It seems to have had at least some effect in helping to increase vaccination rates and therefore probably reducing case numbers and hospitalizations. So we think the program is working well. It will be in place at least until the first quarter of next year. We'll assess it then based on COVID trends here and around the world.
You know, on one hand, I appreciate the direct response. Simply put, no, there's no metric. But on the other hand, I am deeply concerned about what will become a permanent system, a permanent program. And you may think, well, why does it need to be permanent? I mean, once you're vaccinated, you're vaccinated. You can go to restaurants and all of that. And as Jason Kenney says, it's only going to be through the first quarter of 2022 at least, and then they'll reevaluate. Well, by that time, we may well be looking at additional shots required to be considered fully vaccinated. This is the experience in Israel, where starting a couple of weeks ago, if you were fully vaccinated, you are no longer fully vaccinated. You've been devaccinated. You were fully vaccinated one day, the next day you were just 2/3 vaccinated, and if you wanted to get your third shot, that's the only way that you can reclaim that green pass, which is required to go around and engage in civil society. And there's already talk about fourth shots and beyond. And at a certain point, it's like the booster shot is every 3 months, and then that's what you need to start enjoying things in life. And I asked Premier Kenney about that, and here's what he said.
We've seen in other jurisdictions, notably Israel, that at a certain point, 2 shots is not enough to be classed as fully vaccinated for their vaccine passport. I know Alberta has expanded the eligibility for booster shots. Is this a possibility that to be considered fully vaccinated for accessing all of these things under the restrictions exemption program, there could be a point at which 2 shots is not enough?
That's not where we're at now. So far, we continue to see very strong protection from the second shot, the 2-dose regime that we've maintained for the broad population. And as you know, 90% of our ICU patients with COVID are unvaccinated. So that's just a reflection of just how strong the vaccines have been here. But we will closely monitor the data. You've mentioned Israel. We have the advantage, we and countries around the world, of closely watching the Israeli experience to study the impact of their widespread application of booster shots to the population. So we'll be closely watching all of those trends. I won't rule out the possibility that if we find, over the winter, a significant decline the protective effect of the vaccines, that we may very well receive advice from our advisory committee on immunization, as well as the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, for broader application of booster shots. So we'll cross that bridge if and when we come to it. I wouldn't rule that out, but it's not something that is under current consideration.
The answer is not yet, not now, but at the same time, it's also that we're monitoring and we're looking to see what Israel does and how Israel's experience unfolds, and if we need to learn from there and reevaluate, we will. So a couple of main takeaways from that. And again, I appreciate the clarity. I appreciate that he wasn't beating around it. But the two big things that I take is, number one, there's no designated off-ramp for vaccine passports. And number two, we are not ruling out the idea of requiring boosters for being considered fully vaccinated. And we'll look at Israel to see how their experience unfolds. So what we take from that, and this is again just one province, but it's a province who's, I think, even more averse to some of these measures than other places like Ontario and Quebec and Manitoba. Alberta is saying, yeah, we could be in this for the long haul. Now, this aligns with the messaging we've heard from the federal government as well. It was during the campaign just a few weeks ago that Justin Trudeau made the comment that we could be using a temporary vaccine passport until the end of 2022 before a permanent one comes into place. This was that clip from one of his campaign press conferences.
But in the interim, and as a first step, since a number of provinces have chosen to step forward with vaccine certification of their own, we have decided that the best way to do that is to work with each of them so that they are reasonably standardized across the country, and so that there is a federal certification on that will be accepted for international travel. It is an interim measure, perhaps will last a year or so, before we bring in the formalized passport version of it. But right now, because most Canadians are not worried about whether or not they can go to Paris or the Dominican Republic right now, they're worried about whether they can go to their favorite diner down the street. They're worried about when they can go back to the movies, where they're worried about whether they're going to be able to be safe at the gym.
So Justin Trudeau's position on this is that the temporary stopgap vaccine passport needs to last more than a year from now, and then we'll have something permanent. Now, part of this, again, and I've said this time and time again, is that other countries may put whatever barriers they want in place. We do not, as Canadians, have a right to tell the people of Malta or Austria or Thailand or Tanzania or whatever the case may be. We don't have the right to tell them what entry requirements they should have. So in that sense, yeah, if a country somewhere else in the world is going to have a vaccine requirement in place, Canadians need to have an ability to prove their vaccination status. So that's part of the international vaccine passport regime. However, the rhetoric here is moving closer and closer to this becoming a permanent fixture of Canadian society, a permanent fixture of governments. And there's a story that I haven't told on the show that I think is worth sharing here. I was out in Alberta a couple of weeks ago, and a few of us went out after a conference that I was speaking at, the Canada Strong and Free Conference, and we went to a restaurant and had a grand old time. And what happened at that restaurant was that we went back the next day. We had such a good time, we went back. And in Alberta, you need to either have proof of vaccination or a negative test result. And we were all dutifully lining up and getting out the paperwork. And one of the guys in our party was turned down because the overzealous restaurant supervisor or manager, whatever it was, didn't recognize his BC vaccine certificate. It was missing one of the numbers that he wanted to see, so he wouldn't let us in. So, I mean, I've never been turned away from a bar before by a bouncer for being underage or for any other reason. This was like more embarrassing than that, because now all of a sudden you've got some restaurant guy that is just, scrutinizing your vaccination paperwork and deciding that your papers are not in order. And everything's difficult now. It's overcomplicated everything, and if you think it's just as simple as, well, just get the shot and move on, you're sorely mistaken, because we know that there's the threat of changing the goalposts yet again, of moving them yet again, and starting to require booster shots, among other things. And another caveat here is that we're talking about a vaccination regime right now that is very likely to expand to minors under the age of 12. kids as young as 5. We know in Toronto, for example, they're already raring to go, gearing up to start a mass vaccination effort of kids 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old who are not eligible right now. And we know this is going to come at a certain point. And a lot of parents who were fine to get the vaccine themselves, maybe they were eager, maybe they just did it because they had to for work or for some other reason, are going to be a lot more reticent when it comes to getting their children vaccinated. That's going to be a game changer for a lot of people. And all of a sudden, the vaccination rate is going to go down because the denominator, the number of eligible people, is going to increase significantly, and the numerator may not catch up. Well, I mean, it won't catch up with it as much as it is now. I spoke earlier in the week about the idea of having a non-coercive vaccination campaign, which is what they were doing in Leeds-Grenville in Eastern Ontario. All that's done. All governments are doing now is trying to find more ways to coercively impose vaccination on those holdouts who, for whatever reason, don't want to get it. And at a certain point, we have to reckon with that. So to go back to Jason Kenney's comments, even if, I gave him an out in the question. I said, is there a case rate, a hospitalization rate, or a vaccination rate that would trigger the end of vaccine passports? And the answer was no. So what I infer from that is that even if 100% of Albertans, which isn't going to happen, but if 100% of Albertans were to get vaccinated, the vaccine passport would still be there. So every single person, and that would not be enough for this program to go away. And that's very, very important to note. Because the whole point of any of these measures that trample on rights, and make no mistake, these measures do trample on rights, the rights violation has to be narrow, it has to be targeted, and it has to be temporary in order for it to be justified. Now, I'm certain that there are going to be many legal challenges. I don't have a huge amount of optimism given how the court's been ruling on a lot of these things, but nevertheless, that is the proper channel at this point that I know will be pursued. And if a rights violation is justified by the government, a charter rights violation, or by the court, by the judiciary, that's the rule. It has to be very narrowly connected to the stated objective of the government, and it has to be no more than would be necessary to achieve that objective. So if Alberta has a 100% vaccination rate, or a very high vaccination rate, or a vaccination rate that's as high as it can be, it's difficult to justify a vaccine passport system that remains in place. And what happens if we start using this to measure people getting the flu shot? In BC, for example, a couple of weeks ago, doctors were warning of a twindemic because they think the flu season this year is going to be bad. So they're now touting flu shot. So you got to get your COVID shot, your flu shot, your second COVID shot, your booster shot for the COVID shot. Maybe you need to get a booster flu shot. I don't know. And while you're at it, make sure your measles, mumps, rubella shot is up to date. Get the Gardasil vaccine. Get them all. Just get every vaccine out there. Just get them all. That's how you'll be maximally protected. But what happens if your vaccine passport starts to incorporate the flu shot? Again, people may say, well, what's the big deal? Get the flu shot then. The whole point is all of a sudden this thing that was just such an extreme measure that was justified because desperate times call for desperate measures becomes a fixture of the new normal. And you can never allow normal to be changed for something that normal, freedom-loving people should be rejecting. Don't internalize this and think this is how a healthy society is supposed to function. It simply isn't. We'll be back in a moment. Stay tuned.
You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to The Andrew Lawton Show. I speak a lot on this show about the importance of preserving and protecting free speech in Canada, which means government not being able to or encouraged to prohibit what you can say. The only thing worse than government-imposed censorship is the corollary to it, which is compelled speech. Not government telling you what you can't say, but government telling you what you must say, literally putting words in your mouth. Now, this is about as Orwellian as it gets. In fact, I think compelled speech actually goes a little bit beyond some of the themes we see in Orwell. But compelled speech is exactly what's been ordered by an Alberta justice this week against Pastor Artur Pawlowski. Now, Pastor Artur Pawlowski is the pastor in Calgary who first shot to fame when he was chasing out Alberta Health Services inspectors from his church. Then he was later arrested. He's been fined numerous times. And he was in court this week on yet another contempt charge after he was arrested on the tarmac at Calgary Airport. And the judge thought that he wanted to go to jail. The judge in this case, Justice Germain, thought that Pawlowski wanted to be a martyr. So the judge said, well, I'm not gonna play this game. I'm not gonna send you to jail. But what the judge did do is compel speech. He has ordered that Pastor Artur Pawlowski must talk about what public health experts say anytime he talks about his own position on COVID. Now, I don't know how he intends to enforce this, but the judge says the COVID threat has never been greater in Alberta. The Pawlowskis have contributed to an ominous health situation by encouraging others to doubt the legitimacy of the pandemic. And he's issued this order that whenever he speaks about COVID, he must put the other side on record. This is what the judge said. He suggested wording like Pawlowski saying, quote, I am aware that the views I am expressing to you may not be held by medical experts, or the majority of medical experts favor social distancing, or they favor vaccination, unquote. This is literally the judge's order. The judge is putting words in Pawlowski's mouth, saying that anytime Pawlowski speaks his own mind, he has to qualify his own opinion by talking about what these mythical public health experts, hashtag trademark, are all saying. Now, first off, you can drive a Mack truck through it. Norm Macdonald, a fantastic comedian who passed away recently, and that one actually hit me hard. He did in a Netflix special a couple of years ago a fantastic bit that I love and my wife and I love, in which he said that you should never lie, but you should tell the truth in a really sarcastic voice if you want to get away with lying. And he goes on, and I can't do it justice, so you should look up the special. But, he says, for example, if you were talking to your wife and you say, oh, I cheated on you. Yeah, like something like that. And I feel like Pawlowski could do the same thing here, saying, oh, but we know social distancing is the way to go. Oh, we know masks work. Oh, we know you have to be vaccinated. Like, he could make a mockery of this entire thing. So is he going to be back in court because he has to defend his tone? Is he going to be back in court because the judge has to decide, I don't think you meant it. Say it like you mean it. And all of a sudden, the judiciary is this childhood paternalism that you all got from your parents of smacking you to say thank you. No, say it like you mean it. Apologize to your brother. And this sort of nonsense. So this is compelled speech. And again, you may agree with the speech. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you agree with the speech that's being compelled. The fact that it's being compelled makes it tremendously disagreeable. And that is so dangerous. If we're talking about a free society, this is worse than being censored. This is being forced to say something that you do not believe, that you do not mean, which means you're being denied the right to have your own opinion. You can't express your own opinion without expressing the party line. And this is literally the definition of the state line. You have to become a mouthpiece for the state's narrative, whatever it is. And again, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter what they're making you say. It matters that they are making you say it. Now, I'm sure this is going to be appealed, and I hope that a judge at a higher court looks at it and says, in a free society, we do not support compelled speech, but this is what things have come to right now. We've got to take a break. When we come back, more of The Andrew Lawton Show. Stay tuned.
You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to The Andrew Lawton Show. We've talked a lot about what the new normal is going to look like, life after COVID, how long it's going to be until we can get back, all of those things that we had, from the big things to the small things, like, for example, knowing if you're allowed to shake someone's hand when you meet them. But one thing that is going back to the old normal is government spending. There has not been a reality check to government. In fact, they may be more empowered to spend money after all the programs that a lot of Canadians, I think in fairness, were in need of last year. New report from the Fraser Institute finds that in 2021, we're still seeing monumental spending vastly outpacing even recession years, such as in 2008, 2009, and certainly beyond. Jake Fuss is a senior economist with the Fraser Institute and joins me now. Jay, good to have you back on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much for having me on, Andrew.
So this report here, I think it's interesting because when you look at this, everyone knows last year was going to be a bit of a write-off if you wanted fiscal austerity, governments around the world spending hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars. A lot of those programs have carried into 2021, though, it looks like.
Yeah, well, while COVID has certainly created difficulties for government finances across Canada, what we're kind of seeing now is the new normal level of federal spending is really at unprecedented levels in Canadian history. So what we actually see in 2021, for instance, we're expecting per person spending to be over $13,000. This would be significantly above what we saw during the 2009 recession and during the peaks of World War II. It's also significantly above the levels that we saw before COVID in 2019, which were already at record levels in Canadian history. So it's certainly concerning to see that new normal is going to be actually above what we even had before COVID.
Is it fair to call 2021 normal or extrapolate normal from that, given that we are, as you note, still in the midst of a lot of the hardship and heartache from the COVID era?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, ultimately, we still do have some COVID-related spending, some emergency spending that's going on in 2021. But we actually do in our analysis, we also look at 2022, which is expected to be a little bit more normal than 2021. And while per person spending will actually decrease a little bit in 2022, it'll still be, again, significantly above what we saw before COVID. So we're expecting per person spending at the federal level to be about 12 to 18% above what we saw in 2019, which was the last year before the pandemic. And again, 2019 was already at record levels in Canadian history. So if we even just look at 2022, I think that's probably a good barometer of where we're headed in the future as well.
Now, are we adjusting for inflation with these numbers?
Yeah, that's correct. So all of our numbers are adjusted for inflation. So $1 in the year 1870 is equivalent to $1 in the year 2021, for instance, to make it comparable.
So, I mean, with that being said, what's to account for such a significant jump, even from the 08-09 recession? Because, again, in a recession, people would, I think, fairly expect government to be spending a lot of money and racking up deficits. We can argue about whether that's the best fiscal policy, but I think that's politically where the narrative has gone. Well, what's to account for, even in 2018, 2019, pre-pandemic, significantly more spending per person than in 08-09?
Yeah, it's a great question. So really what we saw, beginning in the 2009 recession was a big spike in per person spending across Canada. And then there was a slight decline following that recession for about 5 or 6 years. And then really we saw the spending starting to ramp up again in about 2015, 2016, as the new government started to implement new programs, expand, programs as well. And really what we saw between about 2015 and 2018 or 2019 or so, we really saw per person spending increase by about $1,000. So on an individual basis, the federal government was spending more than $1,000 per person in addition to what they had already spent before that. So we saw that start to climb up above about $9,300 a person. So, obviously this had to do with new programs, but also expansions to old programs as well, like the Canada Child Benefit and a number of other programs. And now what we're seeing, after COVID, talking about introducing new programs as well, like national childcare, national pharmacare, and a number of other programs as well that are only going to compound these costs as well for Canadians.
I know you look at the spending specifically in terms of the cost and not necessarily delving into the detail of the individual programs, but as a taxpayer, I'd look at this number and say, am I getting, 15, 16, 17% more from the government? Am I getting that much more for being a Canadian taxpayer? And I think for a lot of people, the answer would be no.
Well, it's certainly, a question for all Canadians to kind of answer to, looking at the tax rates that you pay relative to, kind of the bang for the buck that you get for all these various services, and also understanding the different cost implications if we have, deficits that we're running because of all this spending. Really what we're doing is implementing higher tax rates in the future to pay for today's spending. At the same time, we're going to face, debt interest costs at the same time in the future, particularly when interest rates are rising. So there are costs and trade-offs to every decision that they make in Ottawa. So it's certainly something important for all Canadians to be informed of.
Now, I know you looked at election spending as well, or specifically election promises, and that is going to, as I understand it, push this even higher.
Yeah, exactly. So before the election, 2021 per person spending was going to be about $12,700. But based on campaign promises by the Liberals, that would actually take you to over $13,000 per person. And, obviously they're in a minority government situation, so they're going to have to work with opposition parties in order to pass budget bills and survive as a government. So we also looked at, one of their likely partners in governing at the NDP's platform. And that would, if they were to implement all of the promises in that platform, it would take you to almost $14,000 at about $13,700. So it's certainly a significant increase in spending, and we're likely to see, that per person spending range somewhere between that $13,000 and $13,700 per person. So that's certainly a significant increase. It'd be about, over 50% higher than what we saw during the 2009 recession.
And we also know, just from looking at other reports, including the Parliamentary Budget Office's assessments, that we could be on track to run up deficits. I think the one scary statistic was until 2070. And I know that a lot of this is all interconnected. The more that's being spent to maintain and pay for debt, to service the debt, all of that, the more money that is coming from tax revenue to do that, which means the less that is available for services, thus more taxes. I mean, all of these things are very much interconnected when Canadians are, by and large, paying more.
Well, exactly. You get into that vicious cycle of deficits and debt over time, and at the same time, not only do we have federal challenges, we also have provincial challenges as well. We have an aging population in Canada, a rising healthcare costs. So, provinces are asking for more money from the federal government right now. So it's significant challenges really all across governments in Canada. We're seeing spending really rise all across the country at the local, provincial, and federal level. So there's going to certainly be big challenges coming out of COVID for all governments.
What do you think it says that we're spending just monumentally more than even in the midst of the war, which is often held up as, the gold standard for when spending is just going to be so wildly out of check?
Yeah, well, that's something that we found was especially interesting in our analysis too, even just looking at 2018 and 2019 before COVID, so really before any crisis period as well. We are spending far more than we were during the 2009 recession and before World War, and what we were spending at the peak of World War II as well. So really during the good times, during 2018 and 2019, we were spending higher than what we were during the crisis levels. So this has kind of had a compounding effect. If you're already spending more than you were during crisis periods during the good times, when bad times come around, then that only spiral out of control even more. And then when you're setting that new normal in 2022 and beyond, what you're going to see is spending again rising and rising and rising further beyond what we were during 2009 or during the Second World War. So it's certainly concerning in that aspect for sure.
To look a bit more forward instead of backward here, I mean, is this a fiscal death sentence, or is it possible to start pushing these figures in the right direction? Because I know that we have seen, if you look at the chart, and there's a good infographic that accompanied your report, we have seen decline, notably in the 80s and 90s towards the 2000s, but we're also dealing with such higher numbers now. So is it possible to start pushing back the other way?
Well, certainly, I would reference the 1990s, for example. I mean, we're not at the near fiscal crisis that we saw during the 90s. But, as things kind of get out of control, then you can get into a situation like the 1990s again. But they made a lot of decisions during the 90s, spending reviews. The Chrétien and Martin government, for example, cut per person spending really by about 17% over a 3-year period. So it was a significant change that they had to make. But obviously they had to make difficult decisions because they had high interest costs, and debt interest costs essentially took up about $1 in every $3 of revenue at that point. Obviously, we're nowhere near that right now. But certainly, you can get to a point in the future where you have to make these difficult decisions. So the longer you put off these decisions, the harder and harder it gets to return to budget balance and to prudent finances.
Now, I have to say something just on a technical note here. I know you've broken it down by in chunks here by notable events, but also terms of government, and I'm guessing that's very deliberate to look at it that way rather than just individual years.
Yeah, exactly. We wanted to show, we're kind of ranking prime ministers kind of on the amount of spending over their terms as well. We obviously want to correct, certain prime ministers had recessions while others didn't. So we want to account for all those different factors. But what we really see, in the ranking of prime ministers, for example, is that Justin Trudeau ranks the highest on the increase in per person spending since the Second World War at about 11.7 to 12.4%, depending on the figure in 2021. So there's significant increases in per person spending. And Trudeau also ranked fairly high even before COVID as well on that list.
Yeah, that's the thing as well. I mean, lest anyone blame the pandemic, we were already at a record high in 2016 to 2020, outpacing the previous record of 2009, which was when the recession was. So I wouldn't let anyone use that as a kind of an escape hatch for accountability on this.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things that we found in our analysis is, Justin Trudeau is actually on track to record the 5 highest years of spending in Canadian history based on 2018 to 2022. So if the spending plans that they laid out in the election come to fruition, we'd actually see, not only before the pandemic and after the pandemic, we'd see those highest years in Canadian history for spending, which is certainly concerning there.
Well, that's one way to put yourself on top in the history books. Jake Fuss, senior economist with the Fraser Institute, the report in question you can catch by looking at prime ministers and government spending, the updated 2021 edition, so brand new. Jake, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much for having me on.
That was Jake Fuss from the Fraser Institute. My thanks to him, and my thanks to all of you for tuning in to today's edition of The Andrew Lawton Show. We will be back tomorrow with a special doing a deep dive into Canada's relationship with Taiwan. We've got a fantastic panel. You won't want to miss that. And then back with the regular edition of the program next Tuesday. My thanks to you all. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you, God bless, and good day, Canada.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.